panelists today are Deval, Desai and Christine Bell from Edinburgh Law School, Jan Pospisil from the University of Vienna, and Babu Rahman from the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And each of them will have 10 minutes to offer some reflections on our theme of global ungovernance. And after that, we'll have really plenty of time, I think, for discussion before our end time of roughly 3:30. Now, I was asked to say just a few very short words before the formal presentations, just as a way of introducing this theme of ungovernance, because it's an unfamiliar term. And it's a term that Deval and I have started to use to try to capture something we think is important about global institution building projects now in their contemporary form. We had a workshop on this theme a couple of years ago. It feels like just yesterday, but a couple of years ago. And we've since published a special issue of the Journal of Transnational Legal Theory on it, to which both Christine and Jan contributed. And I think Harriet has sent a link around to that. So what do we mean, very briefly? By institution building projects, we include everything from the design and redesign of market institutions, regulatory rules and bodies, to judicial reform in the context of rule of law projects, to post-conflict reconstruction of political institutions, and much more. And I think about those projects, we're trying to capture two things, many things, but here's two. The first is the way in which these projects and those undertaking them, who will include you, many of you, seems so often to come up against a kind of impossibility or a failure. So what do we mean? Efforts to transition from conflict to stable peace get stuck in an enduring transitional phase, as both Jan and Christine will talk about. Rule of law reform projects proceed without any clear understanding of what the rule of law really is and how to achieve it. Market institutions are rebuilt without really any meaningful or analytically sound principle for choosing between different market forms, and so on. We can talk more about that, but there's a kind of impossibility or a failure about these projects. And the second point we're trying to get at, and maybe this is the more important point, is that as a consequence, these projects somehow become organized around this impossibility. So let me just say a few words about that. So Christine's going to talk about the ways in which contemporary constitution building is less about creating institutions for a lasting and durable peace, but instead about maintaining a kind of permanent and never resolved transitional order. In some of my work, I've looked at the ways in which building market institutions now is often less about transplanting models and more about ensuring institutions are adaptable and flexible and responsive to economic conditions. And more generally, I think the point we want to make is that the form of these institution building projects is organized in a way which almost self-consciously leaves pretty fundamental questions open, those questions about the content and the nature and the purpose of those institutions. Leaving those questions open and unresolved is in some sense central to the project itself. So that's in a nutshell what we're trying to get at. There's much more to say about it than this, and we will have an opportunity to discuss it in more detail in the question and answer section at the end, after we've had a chance to hear in a bit more illustrative detail from our panelists. But hopefully that provides us at least with something to start off with. So, Deval, let me now pass the floor directly to you, our first speaker, to kick off our conversation and offer your reflections.
Thanks, Andrew. And I'm going to have to admit to some false advertising. This certainly won't be a presentation, but a little bit more a short set of reflections that should last way less than 10 minutes. As Andrew mentioned, I'm Deval. I'm a lecturer in international economic law here at Edinburgh. And I'm going to draw on those experiences, but also a different set of experiences working for many years with the World Bank, and in particular, Justice for the Poor, along with other groups outside that institution on justice reform, rule of law reform, justice and security reform, however you wish to encapsulate it. And so I'm gonna just make a couple of remarks rooted in those experiences to hopefully ground some of the things that Andrew was saying in that sort of concrete context, which will overlap with work experiences thinking of some of you, at least here. So these reflections are going to be an attempt to link with a set of efforts to engage with the deep political complexity of rule of law justice work. And in particular, I'm just going to briefly bounce off thinking and working politically, problem-driven iterative adaptation, those general set of approaches that have emerged in the last half decade to decade. So let me just start with a couple of examples of somewhat personal experience that informed my thinking about ungovernance, but that might also resonate with some practical experiences that you've had. So it might be coming into a justice indicator design process to say that developing these indicators is hopeless. Justice is too political and complex and unknowable. And then having the experience of saying that, not being sort of marginal or irritating, but facilitating the further opening up and development of conversations about justice indicators. Or it might be doing something as mundane as trying to undertake a performance review or performance and expenditure review of some part of the formal justice sector, in part perhaps to evaluate those institutions in some as yet unknown way, but mainly to use that as a vehicle to convene the right political group to have discussions to facilitate some sort of change. Or it might be using the process of designing and implementing a community development agreement, some small technical object, to try and convene difficult discussions about pretty major issues like land redistribution. So common to these experiences is the notion of using the particular instrument, the indicator, the PER, the design and implementation process, to convene quite open-ended conversations about deeply contested, complex political matters. So the instrument in question gives some sort of goal or framework for those conversations, but there's also a lot of work to ensure that that instrument doesn't become too determinate, too full of detail, too prescriptive. Rather, it's kept flexible, contextual, adaptable in a way that facilitates collective work. So there's some shared goal around the instrument, but one which is open-ended enough not to exclude too much or too many people. Now, as I said, this is bouncing off thinking, working politically, problem-driven iterative adaptation, and the like, and you can see, for those of you who know those approaches, some real familiarities. Working adaptively entails keeping a goal to stimulate action, but then deconstructing it periodically. Thinking and working politically entails recognizing that policies are required to generate momentum for change, but they also need to be flexible and adaptable to political context. I'm going to propose a couple of distinctions in what Andrew set out as ungovernance, and in particular its embrace of impossibility, and these movements around engaging with flexibility, adaptation, and context. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to give them as provocations by drawing a couple of really overbroad distinctions between ungovernance and these other ways of working. And so the first, and so just to draw some sort of overbroad sketch, my understanding of something that thinking and working politically, PDIA, do is that they seek to change the ways that practitioners and policymakers think, to get them to think politically, and then to change their operational environment, their tools, their donor structures, to allow them to express that way of thinking in how they work. So you have to think politically to work politically. Sam Hickey calls it a consciousness recently. And specifically, policymakers and practitioners are being asked to think in two ways at once. To credibly undertake things that on some level look like development plans and projects. So to use plans or tools or technical components, while at the same time being a really savvy tactical player, thinking about how to navigate and coordinate background interests, incentives, individuals, and institutions. So the first distinction that I want to draw out is that ungovernance emphasizes practices and brackets questions of consciousness. In other words, the story that Andrew and I and the papers in the specialists you set out occur at the observable level of what people do, and less so the ways in which less so what they think and how they think. And second, ungovernance is an effort to emphasize a range of different practices that link both closure and its impossibility, that link some sort of determinate end goal and the impossibility of reaching it, to link a set of concrete goals and the ability to keep them open-ended. So this means that ungovernance doesn't emphasize that particular individuals or particular agencies have to think in two ways at once. To take an example, a wholly contextual, not policy relevant, it's all complicated type of research, sort of research project that says it's all incredibly messy, it's incredibly hard to even know what to do in this particular context, how we pursue justice and the rule of law. That can be important not only for its substantive insights, but also the ways in which it points out the impossibility of pursuing or attaining something as complicated as the rule of law or justice. And we can think of a role for this sort of work without necessarily having to incorporate within it a set of policy recommendations or the necessity that it synthesize both the impossibility of attaining something like the rule of law and some ways in which we might still try to do so. Stating this a little bit more generally, one way in which we might work in, let's say, an ungovernance mode would be to think about how to bring different practices together to keep claims sufficiently open-ended to enable flexible and political ways of working. To put it another way, we might want to think about working politically in order to think politically rather than thinking politically in order to work politically. It's worth stressing that I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily normatively desirable, but it is a phenomenon that we might want to think through more for its pros and cons. So as said, this is a provocation and an overbroad set of distinctions, but I am suggesting that ungovernance is perhaps a slightly different way or has a slightly different emphasis on how to do flexible, adaptive work in the service of facilitating ongoing political convening or engagement with an enabling environment.
Thanks so much, Deval. Christine, I have you next on my list.
I think it was actually Jan next.
I'm so sorry.
And that probably makes more sense.
I apologize. Jan.
Okay, thanks so much. So my paper in this special issue deals with the question of ungovernance of peace. And before discussing what this means I think it's important to discuss what governance of peace means first of all. So what I mean when I kind of introduce the exact opposite, what we are actually seeing as governance. And there is, and I think what Deval has already introduced this important term of closure. There is the idea in peacemaking, especially since the 1990s, that there is a possibility to really identify all the problems behind an armed conflict, the causes behind an armed conflict, and address them in a very clear set of stipulations, of rulings in what's now called comprehensive peace agreement. And here the important thing of closure comes in, because this comprehensive peace agreement is comprehensive because it is able to capture indeed all the problems that are behind this armed conflict. And then when we come to what we do with this comprehensive peace agreement, it's all about, on the one hand, the implementation. So if there's problems arising, it might be because it hasn't been done well enough in a way. So it's all said there, but like we have to work harder to implement what the comprehensive peace agreement states. Or there is something coming up as a problem which hasn't been foreseen in the comprehensive peace agreement, which in a way then tells us, okay, we haven't negotiated well enough. We have simply overseen or forgot about some of the root causes, and now they're popping up, which is then the second kind of problem. So what is the issue with this kind of thinking? And I want to share, some of you, I have to excuse, some of you might already know it, this graph. But we have produced from the PAX Peace Agreements database a pattern, a common pattern of how peace agreement, like how peace processes since the 1990s look like. So this contains basically, and what these graphs show is how there is an ideal type of how the several types of peace agreements would unfold in a peace process. First, you sign a ceasefire, then you come and start negotiating, then you sign partial agreements, then you sign a comprehensive agreement, and then you go to implementation and negotiate the implementations. This would be the ideal type of how peace governance would be sequenced. Now, if we move through the peace processes since 1990, and this is about 160 processes that you see in this graph, you see that actually every single peace process looks completely different. And the only thing, let me see that I get more out, and the only thing they have basically in common that none of these unfolds like it should be. So the sequence, this ideal type sequence, remains an ideal that never happens. And here we are in a way in the problem of ungovernance, because this ungovernance in a way is what is the state of real peacemaking in a way, because this kind of ideal type closure of negotiating everything, implementing everything, and now we have peace is not going to happen. And here is the problem that becomes kind of tangible also in the policy work, that the consequences then often what remains is the feeling of permanent failure, of not achieving what is meant. So it's a permanent kind of shortcoming that is happening if you still remain in this governance domain. Now there's a second element to this, and this is, I would call it, when we have this problem as ungovernance, as a kind of state of peace building or peacemaking rather, we have also the problem of ungovernance as an unfolding process. And I want to show just a second graph that it is in my article. Let me find it, it's here. I have it in a PowerPoint. And this is how comprehensive peace agreements have developed since 1990. And it's clear, it's not in quantitative terms, not enough probably signed to make this graph significant, but you still see that there was obviously some heyday and some severe decline since the mid-2000s in comprehensive peace agreements signed. The question is, why is this? And here I would argue this is in a way the problem of ungovernance as a process. And this is indeed very much related to the question of what we see as global governance or global ungovernance, that there was something that I would call in a way peace building's Fukuyama moment. So it had this idea that kind of the idea of liberalism kind of wins and the whole world works in this kind of liberal governance agenda was very strong in the 1990s and in the early to mid 2000s, with basically something like an international community behind peace processes. You could get all the global players behind UN resolutions, behind broader processes. And this shows in this huge number of comprehensive peace agreements. And at some point, this obviously breaks and gets lost. And when we see now conflicts nowadays, we have the clear indication. We go from Syria to Yemen to Libya to South Sudan, and you'll find basically what you would almost observe as a global competition playing in these processes. You have a chaos. You have not the conditions there to even forge something like this comprehensive peace settlement. So what does this mean now? What are the consequences? And here, some things that Deval already said in his reflections very much applied to the peace-building sphere as well. There is a lot about flexibility, adaptation, and context that already kind of happen. So we are not talking about something that should happen, but something that really happens in contemporary peacemaking and what peace-building is then in the broader sphere. Well, we have worked in the PSRP, in the Political Settlements Research Program, was then thinking of, okay, what is actually what these peace processes are doing when they're not able to really implement the positive peace that they intend to. And we came up with this idea of formalized political unsettlement, where we would argue that these agreements are indeed able, often, to bring conflict parties to a formalized state where they kind of agree to disagree in a certain kind of way and formalize the contestation in a way that the open conflict declines. There is perhaps even armed conflict stopping, but the conflict remains very much there. The deep contestation remains at the heart of actually this unsettlement, or this, then we could call it then in the broader sense, ungovernance of what is unfolding. So what does this mean now? And I think the main claim I want to make with this is that the first important consequence of this kind of thinking is to do away with failure. So if we don't achieve this kind of broad, closed kind of vision of goal, it's not because we're failing, it's because this goal is just not achievable in such situations of ungovernance. And we might have to deal with certain layers within this process that we can't kind of design, sequence, and clearly govern, but we need to deal with them flexibly and in a very pragmatic way that kind of decides on what to do next, more on action-based, more in the real kind of philosophical pragmatism of finding the goals why we walk around a transitional kind of avenue. And I've just highlighted some of the possible ideas where we might come together. So one of these consequences might be in terms of space, where we still think as the big kind of goal of the peace process to be the national. And we realized that when we started to work about local peace agreements and the role of local peace agreements in a certain conflict setting, the question we would get almost immediately is, okay, what are these local peace agreements doing for the national peace? Are they supporting a national peace process? Are they even undermining it? Or what is their role in a national peace process? But perhaps it is that they don't have a real role in a national peace process because the idea of this national peace process as such has a flaw in itself. Because we should perhaps more think about peace agreements and these kinds of settlements as something which is dissolving more than resolving a national kind of conflict landscape. Perhaps this kind of national thinking of national space, or having a layered thing between a national, subnational, local conflict, is something that might be helpful in one way or the other for designing certain policies that are then kind of sellable to funders or whatever, but they might not really tell us what is happening in a conflict setting. Another issue might be time, because often these sequences that are pointing towards a closure of a process have also a very clear set timeline. Every transitional process and every implementation expert will tell you they're just as valuable as clearly put on a timeline. You have like whatever 360 days to do this, 3 months to do this, and you have certain benchmarks along the way. And we've worked when we investigated also together with colleagues at the London School of Economics, especially the Sudanese peace process and other processes in the Red Sea region. It was Alex Deval actually pointing us towards this nice term of agility, the idea that often parties would approach negotiations, agreements, and also then implementation phases with a waiting approach to just see what happens. And the thing is, with agility, the ability to wait, the ability to outwait even others, is not just kind of patience towards a certain goal. I think the important implication of agility is that we wait until we know what we want, because who knows now what we will want 1 year down the line. So why would we settle now for something when we could just wait and see? And this, in a way, has some strategic component, really. So it's kind of the promise always when we approach these processes, we always look towards some certain end goal. But perhaps agility is not about the end goal. Agility is about the ability to wait before making decisions, before settling on a certain strategy, before settling on a goal, because it is the strategy and the goal in itself. what does this mean for especially international peace building support is, I would argue, a certain rehabilitation of conflict management, which has been over some years really almost like a four-letter word in the peace building realm, because conflict management is kind of a bad thing. We have to be for transformation, we have to be for resolution, and all these kinds of things. But actually, perhaps it's not all bad with management, because in a way it's always up to people themselves to kind of sort these things out. And perhaps it's often more something that develops along with actions in a non-closed, like as Deval would say, in a state of non-closure, which is in a way very pragmatic, also not necessarily normative. And I think there's lots to learn from processes that are ongoing there, and not everything which is not kind of tied to a certain kind of end goal, like what we think of how peace looks like, is a bad thing. With this, I think, thanks a lot, and then looking forward to your questions in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Jan. Christine.
So thank you. I'm going to pick up on what Jan said and talk about what are the types of law that then emerge to facilitate the types of unsettlement. Ungovernance for me, I think, links and almost flows from radical disagreement. And I'm using that in the sense that Oliver Ramsbottom used it in the Israel-Palestine context. And that's really the idea that there's forms of disagreement which go beyond normal disagreement about policy options or choices or even positions, because they've no possible zone of reconciliation. And more than that, any attempt to create dialogue around their possible reconciliation, because they imply competing world visions, really, rather than bridging the conflict, produces further disagreement and becomes wrapped into the ongoing disagreement. And I think that type of disagreement characterizes the disagreement that is at the heart of armed conflict. So I wanted to talk a little bit as a lawyer, which is probably quite unusual for me, and as a public lawyer. And public law is quite simply the law that provides for the business of government, that sets in place the institutions of government, and how they relate to each other and how they govern. So, for example, constitutions, which put in place the structures of government, or administrative law that regulates the business of government. And if we have a thing called ungovernance rather than governance or government, what then is the type of law that enables that? Is law absent? Well, no, it's not. Law is something that's in place and enables ungovernance. So I was just interested in, are there particular ways that law is working to do that? And how does it compare with the role of law in enabling government? And what I really found was that there were 5 different legal techniques of ungovernance that would be considered really unusual things to go on with regard to normal public law, but there are core ways that law facilitates ungovernance. So I'm just going to go through them, and all of them in my piece I applied to the conflict area, and I'll give some illustrations of that, but I think they apply to other areas, and in fact in my piece I sort of look at ways in which these techniques are emerging as part of the sort of ungovernance arrangements of the Brexit settlement in the EU as well. So firstly, what iterative constitutionalisms, we think of constitutions as static things that have resolved a broad political settlement. They leave open bits, but they set in place the values, the institutions. But if ungovernance is about not being able to reach closure and not being able to reach a political settlement, but create a state of unsettlement, often it makes it really impossible to then capture a static constitution. And so a characteristic of ungovernance are forms of interim constitution, repeated interim constitution, or constitutions with rapid and continual forms of amendment beyond the normal situation. The second technique is what I've called institutionalized strategic dissonance. So I'm sorry for so much law and so many terms. So strategic dissonance is talked about in the business field, where you have a company that knows that the world has changed and how it operates. A good example is often given of Kodak and the digital world, right? So Kodak was thought too big to fail. It would never go out of business. It was the leader in the field. but it entered a period of strategic dissonance as regards that digital photography being the new thing. Instead of responding and changing its business, it sort of acted as if that reality didn't exist, right? And that in that particular example, the dissonance was resolved at some point by the failure of Kodak, right? In our context, institutionalized strategic dissonance is where to reach a form of agreement, you take something like the dispute in Northern Ireland over where sovereignty should lie in the future of Northern Ireland, and you say, well, we're going to create a commitment to both a Northern Ireland set of self-determination and an all-Ireland set of self-determination, which of course, this is the very dispute at the heart. And then you put in place a set of procedures that don't really match with the ability to commit to two different projects of self-determination at once, because of course that logically can't be done. So you have a vote and it's in two parts, but one vote really controls the outcome. So there's a mismatch between what you say your goal is to commit to two things that can't be committed to, and between the mechanisms that you put in place. The third technique is drawing together forms of law as assemblage, so forms of law that straddle international law and domestic law, and bringing them into sort of new fluid frameworks and can kind of move around between competing sources of legitimacy. I'm not going to give too many examples, this will take too much time, but I can illustrate that. But I suppose we see it really clearly, and there's another piece in the collection on transitional justice and transitional justice where people are drawing on both international and domestic law and different regimes within international law to try to create ways to square the circle between the need for accountability of armed actors and the need to not put them all in prison or you wreck the settlement. The third legal technique is the fourth legal technique are what I call legalized political reset moments. And this is the idea that at certain points, politics will just need reset. The normal institutions won't bring it forward as possible, and institutions may just collapse. And while law traditionally does understand that sometimes law runs out, like in a moment of revolution, all bets are off, there's no real framework. In fact, in this instance, law finds ways to bend and to tolerate something that is technically either not lawful or not governed by law, sort of a-lawful. The last provision is, Jan used this word agility, and just to explain where it comes from, Alex Deval has picked up on it because it's a word that's heavily used in South Sudan. In Sudan, it's an Arabic word, and it just means delay, postponement, deferral. But it's kind of nice because in English it sounds like agile, this legal provision for forms of delay and agility, always putting in a capacity to extend and to amend and move forward. And of course you can already hear from the way I'm talking that all of these techniques and ways come together and complement and support each other. So in conclusion, what I would sort of say is, are these techniques new, and is part of the question of, is ungovernance something new or is it always there? Well, law's always had bits of these techniques for exceptional situations or really hard issues. But I think what's different in how we see these techniques coming in and supporting, in normal settings, they're seen as the exception to the rule. But in the settings that we're looking at, they're almost the whole space of public law and the norm, rather than the exception. And fundamentally, that means that you still have, to sort of be a bit theoretical, you still have this relationship of public law as being the law. In historically, we look at public law as the law that emerged together with the concept of the nation state and enabled it and is part of it. But here, I think we see these new techniques of public law coming together and enabling these forms of ungovernance. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you. That's a great introduction to these thoughts. Babu, can I call on you to offer some initial reflections, at least, on these presentations?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. And they are very much initial reflections. And since this is a kind of experimental session, I'll take the cop-out way of asking a whole bunch of questions, probably more than I'll give any answers from my point of view. I'll preface all my comments by saying I'm speaking in a personal capacity and not on behalf of either Her Majesty's government or the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office in particular. And I'll focus very much on, I'll be very parochial. Others are probably better qualified, I think, to address the question of whether the framework of ungovernance adds anything to existing theories of politics or international relations or international organization at an intellectual or an academic level. But from where I sit as someone working on situations of conflict and instability around the world, I can certainly see the value of it. And I think it's a really useful and good segue from the concept of unsettlement, which Christine and Jan know I'm a big fan of, and I have been an advocate for it whenever I and other colleagues have tried to get to grips with what's happening in situations of peace talks or mediation or transitions from war to peace. I'll use a couple of examples from my own experience of kind of theatres of conflict and instability to illustrate my points. I think the two big places for me in which it helps is that it paints the picture of what unsettlement looks like in practice. And like the idea of unsettlement, for me, ungovernance helps to manage international and national expectations of how quickly non-warlike political relations can be established. And that in practice, whatever your substantive or normative commitment to the liberal peace-building model, you're likely to continue to face constant and fundamental contestation, renegotiation, mini-failure and resetting of relationships within governance of societies affected by conflict and instability. For example, ungovernance can help us better understand the recent US-Taliban agreement in Afghanistan, where you have essentially a broad set framework of rules governing specific actions that each is supposed to take, as well as some general principles. Yet you also have ongoing and fundamental contestation between the two parties within that framework, but without each of them actually falling out of the agreement. Looking at the ongoing negotiations between the Taliban and those representing the Afghan Republic, it's certainly possible, and in some ways difficult, to not see a desirable outcome of that process as a government that contains parties that are on the one hand committed to a peace agreement, but which retain fundamentally incompatible interests and objectives on both how the peace agreement is supposed to be implemented, what it is that is the result of the peace agreement, and what is supposed to go forward in terms of implementation. Which, for me, as with the idea of unsettlements, raises the question of what the trajectory is to get out of ungovernance and unsettlement. And I think that it will be really, as you all can kind of delve into this more, I think that from my point of view would be some interesting handrails to establish. A second big area of utility is that for countries emerging from conflict or trying to implement, for example, a partial peace agreement in the midst of ongoing conflict, it also helps could help to understand the difference between bumps in the road and the road veering off the edge of a cliff. When instability and turmoil is a necessary part of the prevailing governance arrangements, it's important to understand when it's a signal that this is normal or that the whole machinery might be about to break down. This was certainly a challenge for international actors when I was working for the UN in Somalia between 2013 and 2015. I won't speak to Somalia today because I'm not engaged in that, but but it was something that we struggled with on a daily basis, not least because of the dynamic political situation and the difficulty for outsiders to understand what was happening in real time, simply because we didn't have the access to a lot of the Somalis in the way that we would in anywhere else. Well, why does that matter? Well, because where international actors have limited leverage or capital, or have limited will to use what leverage they have, it's important to pick and choose when and how you use it. The Somalia example also begs the question of what the realm of ungovernance is. I'm not sure if I'm using the right words there, but essentially, are there different types of ungovernance? In Somalia, all political actors, other than the insurgents, obviously, were committed to, a federal state as set out in the provisional constitution. There was little disagreement amongst anyone on that issue, and everyone agreed that they should work within it. But that didn't stop existential struggles within the government. It also didn't stop fundamental disagreements between Parliament and the executive, and between both of them and emerging subnational governments. So I think, in Somalia, certainly as I dealt with it, we were still very much in the realm of I think, what was the term Christine used? The fundamental disagreements, albeit between parties that were not actually using violence. Three more questions that I'd lob in. I think that would be helpful from my point of view. The first is, how do you know when what you're seeing is the result of continuing fundamental disagreements or something else? So how do you know when what you're seeing happen is ungovernance or possibly the result of some other thing, be it an exogenous factor or something else that's endogenous? Is ungovernance an enduring condition? And I'm struck here by some of the earlier comments about, we come to this out of frustration of seeing situations that just don't change, and where projects just never succeed because they just don't seem to work. Is ungovernance actually enduring, or is it transient, or is it something that ebbs and flows, and how does it transform? Also, are there degrees of ungovernance? Even above the threshold of fundamental disagreements, and if so, what does that mean for how we understand it and how we deal with it? And maybe slightly abusing my privilege, but if we assume that governance is desirable, is ungovernance undesirable, or is it better than no governance? It feels like that's a no-brainer, but I just wonder whether, when we, particularly as international actors, try and address issues of ungovernance, do we have to exert due diligence to prevent ourselves from breaking whatever framework is holding together the limits of governance as it exists? I'll stop there.
Babu, thanks so much. There's some great comments, great questions there, which I think will really open up the discussion. So, I think what's emerging from these 4 presentations is really a sense of ungovernance as, and I know this is sort of a simplification of what you all have said, but a sense of ungovernance as a kind of work which produces results of some kind while keeping fundamental questions open, right? So, Deval, you talked about convening ongoing political work. Christine, you talked about radical disagreements being postponed, not addressed. Jan, you developed the notion of this formalized political unsettlement, right? So I feel as if that's the heart of what's come out today, at least. And Babu, you've really raised a bunch of really, really important questions. It sounds like there's some resonance of these ideas with the experiences that you've had, but the questions you've raised are, you know, is this a temporary thing? Should we think of it as a temporary thing? And how do we get out of it? This is a really interesting question of how we distinguish it from breakdown, but also this question of what counts and what ought to count as a radical disagreement, of the sort of question which should be left open, whereas the sort of question which doesn't need to be left open. You know, as I think of my work, I'm thinking, you know, big frictions in the trading system, are these really radical disagreements about the shape that market economies should take? Or are they, which maybe ought to be left open to some degree? Or are they just much more small ball questions about how the steel market ought to be organized, you know? And how do we characterize those? So this is a really fabulous intervention. So now's the time for us to have a discussion. Can I suggest that if you want to make an intervention, ask a question, please either just raise your hand by clicking the reaction button on the bottom of your screen and raising your hand, and both Harriet and I will be looking for that. Or, because that isn't available to everyone, simply type into the chat function, hand raise or me, or I'd like to ask a question, and we will call upon you. So this is the opportunity for you to start doing that, while I, as an initial matter, just look at our panel members and see if there's any intervention that you guys want to make as an initial matter as others formulate their questions. So I mean, I think I'm happy to jump in while others collect their thoughts. There's a lot there. I mean, I think I would simply repose, Babu, your question about the temporality of this and the trajectory. Should we be thinking of this, and by this I mean, let's keep this simple as keeping radical disagreements open, you know, a form of development work or conflict building work or whatever, of keeping underlying radical disagreements open. Should we understand that as a temporary state? Ideally a temporary state, or is this something that, you know, is merely a fact that hits us and that we need to just live with in almost in perpetuity? I don't know. What do our Christine, Deval, Jan, I don't know, or others? How do you respond to that intervention? And then Laura, I will call on you in just a moment.
I mean, I kind of wonder about that quite a lot, to just come in there. I think it is possible that governance resolves, you know, it can resolve demographically in states where you've divided groups and then you really have a majority position. I think it can resolve somewhat because the on-settlement framework does really change positions. You can't always understand when that's going to happen. So I think there's certain forms of disagreement which are probably susceptible to resolution, and it remains an open question whether they are or not. But I think where the basic blocks and positions within a society aren't largely changed, that in some senses you're always in an ongoing ungovernance terrain, although aspects of that may become quite stable. But there's something quite curious to me about the regeneration capacity of ungovernance, and this makes, I think, Babu's challenge of can it help you distinguish between bumps on the road versus complete breakdown, that can be quite difficult to identify, because while in, say, contracts, whenever somebody breaches, you know, ultimately the remedy is you can breach right back and you can call the contract off. Of course, the goal of dealing with breach and the peace process thing is to keep the show on the road and to keep putting it back together. So it becomes a kind of the peace process is dead, long live the peace process dynamic. So even a major bump on the road will actually accelerate attempts to bring everybody back within the frame of the peace process, rather than say, okay, now the other side's entitled to breach as well. So and I suppose like one of the few tractions that I can see international actors and the peace process itself has is that actually parties to the peace process are really reluctant to see them, to articulate themselves to be fundamentally breaching and to be the people who are pulling the plug on the peace process. And even though that might not seem like very much leverage, it actually sometimes is the main leverage and of then trying to force the parties to live up to their expectations. So I think where the process itself has mechanisms that enable a bump in the road to be dealt with, then it's easier for it to be contained as a bump in the road. Where it doesn't, whether it will derail the process, I think depends on whether there's the sort of design ingenuity and political will among both international and national actors to create a way of containing the bump in the road within the process or not.
Thanks, Christine. We have 2 questions lined up in the chat room.